Wow. Speaker, the number of people joining the Catholic Church is seriously decreasing in the current world. That is, the number of people that ascribe to Catholic ideologies, especially in the developing world, is becoming at an all-time low. The Catholic Church needs to change something about the way it runs itself. We tell you the best way it can increase the number of people joining the religion is to accept these folk saints. 4 points of setup. Firstly, on the just like the Catholic Church losing the members, note that, like, especially as people become more wealthy, they're less likely to be religious. Why is this the case? Because they become more educated, especially and then and learn about science, and then religion seems to be out of touch. Secondly, we think that the majority of people that believe in the Catholic Church are from countries like Latin America. Note that whilst these are not super wealthy now, they are rapidly experiencing economic growth, which means that they are seriously at risk of losing their religion in the future, which means that the Catholic Church needs to be focusing on appealing to these type of people. That is the type of people that, believe in these folk saints. Thirdly, we think the Catholic Church is having it finds it difficult to control the population in further parts of the world. It is in these parts further away from, the Vatican and its core power, which are much more likely to see breakaway, Christian sects, much more likely to see televangelists. This is because, they're able to appeal to people in more relevant ways in which the, rich Vatican is unable to do so. And fourthly, we think that it is in the main interest of the Catholic Church are firstly to increase the membership in that church, and secondly, to maintain some sort of ideological purity. But we will contest that it is increasing membership. That is its main aim. 2 points of substantive in this speech. Firstly, on increasing membership to the church. Secondly, on ideological purity. Okay, on the number of people in the church. We tell you that this is the best way to increase the number of people that identify as Catholic. Why? 4 reasons. Firstly, because we think that accepting folk saints as saints makes people feel represented. Note that in the status quo, we have very few saints from developing countries. Why is this the case? 2 main reasons. Firstly, just historically, the first Christians were all from Europe, from the developed world. But secondly, all subsequent leaders have been from the developed world. We note that, although this is not true in the case of Pope Francis, all popes leading up to him were. So this has established a norm of European conventions, and especially judging and accepting saints. We think that this makes people, very unhappy, because it implies that, people from the developed world are less saintly, less morally good. And it really conflicts with people in the developing world, because whilst they may feel strongly about religion, they feel it no longer is applicable to them or can apply to their experiences, because the types of, requirements that it puts on members cannot possibly be achieved by their situations. It creates an institution that can only be, succeeded by people that are rich, that are white, that are, privileged. Note that in this comparative, people in the developing world finally feel like they can be represented by church. This is a huge increase, especially as we tell you that these are the people that are most likely to be Catholic or lose their Catholic faith in the future. Secondly, we think that these saints are very popular, as is stated in the info slide. So we think that, the church, accepting them shows that they are reflecting, what most people already accept to be true, which is just going to be a really popular move by the people in these countries, which means that they are more likely to stay in the church and not likely to fall out. Thirdly, we think that it means that the church admits previous wrongdoing. That is, admits that it has previously isolated people in the developing world. It admits it has previously not recognized these saints, so it's going to be, extremely popular. And fourthly, we think that it decreases the amount of people that are going to join breakaway religions. We've already told you this is an extreme problem in countries like Latin America. We think that the fact that we then reduce the number of people that feel the need to find religions in these things like televangelism actually increases then the strength of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is losing strength because there are so many sub-branches, because it can no longer have a big centralized power. We tell you this stops. We tell you the Catholic Church gets stronger. Why is this so important? 2 things. Firstly, because the Catholic Church literally sees it as its key mission to increase the number of Catholics. This literally allows the Catholic Church to achieve what it was set out to do, that is to spread Christianity. Secondly, we think that notably the Catholic Church just likes to have power, and the more power it can exert over the more people is good. Okay, and but note here, what this point really proves to you is that we tell you that it is the greatest risk of people in countries like Latin America from withdrawing from the Catholic Church, especially in the future. We ensure they stay. That's good. Okay, on ideological purity. Look, we're going to predict that the opposition is going to say that, this is incompatible with the current ideals of the Catholic Church, and that the Catholic Church wants to maintain its core beliefs. But we're going to tell you that it's not incompatible. That is because, firstly, all people are sinners. Even Mary was a sinner. All biblical people, even John, was a sinner. Most biblical people are often prostitutes. It is literally written in the Bible that all humans are sinners. We think that therefore it's very inconsistent in the Catholic Church, to forgive the sins of some, like Mary John, but not of others. We think that this actually harms the purity of religion. I'll take closing if you have one. Opening.
Sure. Would someone who is not a Catholic remotely care about this? Or is this at best a measure to slow the death of Catholicism?
People that are not Catholics would 100% care, because it makes it more relevant. We think people don't choose to become Catholics because it's seen as white privileged developed men that aren't at all applicable to them. Okay, on my second reason why it's not incompatible with a Christian ideology, because Christianity is literally about the forgiveness of sins. It tells people that even though you sinned, because you do other good stuff, because you look to God for forgiveness, you can go to heaven and the church will forgive you. We think that it's actually much more in line with the Christian church to say that even though you may have sinned in one sense, if you then follow Christian ideals and try to find compensation through God, we will forgive you and you can still be saintly. Thirdly, we think that it's important to note what the requirements are for becoming a saint. In fact, firstly, to just do good works, and secondly, to embody Catholic ideals. We think that all of these people fulfill this. But know that even if this is not true and you didn't buy this, why do we think that the number of people and the number of Christians you get is still more important? Because firstly, people that join the church still do Catholic things. That is the number of people that follow Christian ideals still increases. The core beliefs of the Christian church doesn't change. You still have more Christianity. But secondly, we think that the church already admits degrees of sins. This is a very small admittance. We think it's worth the trade-off. So proud to
Ari, I think that's
two, one, or three things in my speech. First of all, I'm going to do a bit of framing that missed from opening government speech. Second of all, I'm going to provide some direct rebuttal on their case. And third of all, I'm going to set my points for this, why we oppose this motion. First of all, I think opening government missed a crucial word in this motion, which is officially. Officially means that those folk saints are recognized at the level of the papacy, at the global institutional level of the Catholic Church. Please note that as opening opposition, we don't oppose folk saints to be recognized at the local level, at the level of the countries, or recognize that they are still part of the folklore and integrated within the Catholic rites of some countries. We just refuse to recognize them at the level of the Catholic level of the Catholic Church. We refuse them to be recognized officially by the papacy for reason I will expand on later on during my speech. This clarification having been made, 2 points of direct rebuttal to opening government. First of all, they tell us that it's going to increase the number of people identifying as Catholics, especially in countries in Latin America and Africa. I have two issues with that. First of all, those people in Latin America and in Africa are still, in those countries, have still the highest population of people identifying with Catholicism in the first place. The issue those countries have is the fall of Catholicism and the fall of the number of those people identifying with Catholicism. The issue is that they don't fall out of Catholicism into atheism. The main issue of the Catholic Church in this country is that those people fall from Catholicism into Protestantism. Why is it so increasingly important? The fact that in Protestantism, the dogma is against the glorification of saints. So how are you going to keep people who just refuse the glorification of saints back into the Catholic Church through getting? For me, it's totally contradictory. Second of all, they tell us that all saints are sinners. Why should we let all people are sinners? Why should we let saints get away with it and not other people? it's not in the canon of the Catholic Church that saints are perfect and are absolved of all sins. The thing is that in the canon of the Catholic Church, saints are not perfect people. They are just global role models that should be followed, whose values are identified as being the value of the Catholic Church. Saints to purgatory. All saints had to expiate their sins at the end of the day. Their saints are not recognized by the Catholic Church as being sinless. Even Saint Thomas has been recognized as being a saint, even though he just went against, he refused to believe in the ascension of Christ in the first place. So no, sinners are not sinners, and saints are not mutually exclusive. So this having been said, why do we as opening opposition believe that it's a fundamentally bad idea to recognize local saints, folk saints, as global role models for the Catholic Church? For the main reason that the issue and the crucial point about those folk saints is that they are folkloric. They insert themselves within a specific context that is not necessarily known by other people around the world. Folk saints are inherently part of the local context, and because of that, they need to be only recognized as a local level. Why is it so much the case? Because basically the issue is that if you have a folk saint in Mexico, for example, who robbed people during a civil war in order to feed the poor, see it as a saint, Saint Robin Hood, these actions of the saint are justified by the context and the extreme context in which this saint was. They were justified by the need of this saint to abide by the extreme conditions that were in the country at the time, for example, a civil war. Those local saints can also integrate themselves into a more cultural, folklorical context. For example, local folk saints in the ancient Inca Empire are integrating some parts of the legends of traditional gods and of the ancient Inca religion. If you start integrating it within a wider audience without the context, you are fronting two different set of values, risking the risk of a culture clash with three main negative impacts for the Catholic Church as a result. Before I extend on those impacts, closing yes.
So if you say that the Catholic Church must not integrate anything which does not apply to every single group, then why does the Catholic Church have saints such as the saints of miners, the saints of agricultural workers, and so on?
Closing, this is not what I said. I said that those saints that integrate into a local context should remain at a local level. Miners are going to be found at every single level of human society regardless of the country, whilst a saint that is here because he was the saint of the revolution in Mexico is only going to be relevant in Mexico. So why is this bad? Because it will basically create divisions within the church with three possible negative impacts. First of all, in the most extreme case, a basic schism in the Catholic Church. For example, you start integrating the god of prostitutes. The patron saint for prostitutes in Brazil, whilst in every single Brazilian understand that this saint was elevated at the level of the saint, not because they were a prostitute, but because they treated AIDS. But they will still be known as the patron saint of prostitutes. This will go against what certain people think to be the values of the church. They are going to either leave the church or create their other church. Second of all, at more believable impact, it will feed the conservative cardinals that are within the Catholic Church and are trying to get a more and more extreme Catholic Church and a more and more conservative church. The Catholic cardinals in the United States are known for opposing the policies of the Pope. They are known for trying in the background to get a more conservative Pope on the throne of St. Peter. The issue is that if you start creating divisions within the church, you give them more mature to feed their resentment. Last of all, it's going to lead to a fall in donations for the Catholic Church, because some people will not refuse to be affiliated with those new values introduced within the church. They are going to stop their donations. It's particularly true in the West, where the church is extremely dependent on donations in order to maintain historical properties and historical churches. For all those negative reasons, we beg you to oppose. Thank you very much.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Look, the first issue I want to ask in this debate is, how do people respond within the religion? Because the push we hear from OO is that, but what if international people really backlash against this and are very unhappy? What are the 4 responses to this? First here, the push we hear is that these people ought just be local saints and not global saints. I think that local saints probably don't exist. And the reason why they probably don't exist is because the Catholic Church is literally just about global doctrine. It is the Catholic Church or not the Catholic Church. And notably, if you're not the Catholic Church, you are literally heretical. You are going against the scriptures and the teachings of the Catholic Church, which means that local saints aren't likely to exist or be okay within the frame of the Catholic Church. And instead, people who do believe in the Catholic Church are likely to believe that they're in some way committing heresy, because they're literally going against the teachings of the church itself. But that often conflicts with their ability, because their belief that these people were actually really good. They did perform saintly duties, etc. Which means that you can't just have this weird OO like local saint versus global saint. Like, that just doesn't exist. Second tier analysis. Note that all their stuff about why it ought to be applicable to all people in the globe and how like not all people know the narratives. Let's just flip this, right? Like, most of the saints are from the developed world. It seems to suggest that people in the developing world don't know their context to the fullest extent, aren't able to empathize with them to the fullest extent, don't fully back them to the fullest extent, which seems to suggest, no, people don't know all the saints and the stories of all the saints. There are literally like hundreds, if not thousands of saints. People just know a set of saints that are applicable to them and are likely to believe in them. They're extremely unlikely to care about literally all the other saints. So I think OO's like worst case, like the best case scenario for OO is literally just like no one else cares except for the people in the developing world who feel really good because now they're represented. Third tier analysis, right? I think it's important to see like why there's no analysis that OO gives about why the Catholic Church is unable to message the context of these people to everyone else, because it seems to suggest that along with the the canonization of a particular saint, there's normally the story that's messaged to everyone. In the same way that you message the story of the Bible or the story of all these other saints from the developed world. So in the same way that you're just able to message the context of a particular saint, being like, look, this is during a civil war, during a famine or something, during oppressive government or regime. That seems to be something that the Catholic Church is very able to do. It's probably something that it very much wants to do, because it wants to emphasize the saintliness and morality of a particular saint, so they have a large incentive as well. The final thing to say is, on the push of pre-Catholic saints, I think this is extremely unlikely. And the reason why it is unlikely is because note that these people are really popular amongst the existing Catholic population. And it seems to be that existing Catholic population, which ascribes to the majority of the teachings of the Catholic Church, is not likely to be worshipping like heretical pre-Catholic figures that are literally contradictory to the fundamental bases of Christianity about like, the teachings of Jesus, etc. So it's not like to be this assertion of like Incan, figures or something. It seems likely that there's local heroes that have happened that themselves believed in Catholicism and are part of the Catholic community at their particular time, which are likely to be the types of folk impacts, which means that I think at this point, OO doesn't have a leg to stand on. The final thing for us, one thing, which is on the Protestant people leaving Protestantism. I don't think that the reason why people are leaving to Protestantism or other Catholic faiths is because they're really pissed off that the Catholic Church has saints or no saints. It seems likely instead they're just unhappy with how unrepresentative the Catholic Church is of them. And so if anything, they're less likely to believe Protestantism, which is exactly what we told you. Yeah, so I don't think they show the delta in that particular thing. So second question, what did we tell you that went completely unresponded to? We told you that instead, people within the religion are likely to be super happy. The first thing I'm going to flag here is, note that I think the majority of other people in the religion outside these particular areas are not likely to have like a super strong effect, caring or whatever. And the reason is just because like they don't really have an incentive or an ability to, because like, look, there are literally thousands of saints. Although making a new saint is slightly novel, that also happens semi-regularly. So it seems unlikely that everyone's just super honed in on these particular saints, because most of the people in like, you know, the developed world, US, England, wherever, don't really give a shit. So they don't really backlash in particular bad ways. Whereas all of our analysis affects the people that are likely to care, which are the people in these particular regions. And we told you that those people are likely to be really happy because it shows the Catholic Church is listening to their demands, because these people are already super popular. So these people already like, you know, super agree with these particular figures, that they see that the church has an ability to admit wrongdoing. And the impact of all this is that they're much less likely to join the breakaway religions that tell people and lure people away by saying that, oh, you know, look how unrepresented the Catholic Church is. They don't understand how Christianity is here in Latin America. Come join my religion as well. But closing flags a point about like, oh, but these people are broken away anyway. Obviously, we can either get these people back or prevent people from leaving more so in the first place. So comparatively, we are better. At this point, I'm happy to take a POI from closing if you've got anything.
Yeah, I was hoping you could explain in greater detail to me why it is valuable to increase membership at the sacrifice of the sanctity of the religious teachings. How does that benefit people's eternal souls, per se?
Cool. The first thing is your opening literally said it doesn't violate ideological purity, so please don't knife them. The second reason is we told you why it's not a violation of ideological purity. Because, and the reasons are, as my LO's flag, the fact that, my PM flag, that people, the core to the Christian idea is that one, that people always with a sin. Two, it is able to make up for the fact for their sins through penitence, right? So these people are likely to embody both of these ideals. So even though they have committed sins, that does not violate the ideological purity of the Catholic Church. The final thing is to note that they obviously fulfill all the other criteria of being saints. They embody Catholic ideals, etc. So it doesn't violate that ideological purity. But even if we do want to take that, here are the reasons why the Catholic Church is still going to value more people. Number one, note that there's a hierarchy of sins. It is not like, you know, them literally just going out committing murder, something is indefensible. Note particularly that the Catholic Church is able to defend this in lots of ways, particularly to the people who already like them in status quo, because those people are not likely to see it as a violation of ideological sanctity. So those people, the people that react the most or care about the most, are unlikely to do so. The second thing is, the Catholic Church probably cares about the net amount of Christian activities practiced, even if in some cases you do something that violates it. All the people in status quo already believe in them. That doesn't change their changing their behavior in any way. It just changes their views of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church probably cares about this more since it's unable to affect change in any other way. So happy to propose, vote OG.
All right, I think that's speaker.
One, my partner spoke about the negative impacts of recognising folk saints and how it leads to delegitimization of the Catholic Church. I'm speaking about the positive impacts of allowing folk saints to exist on an exclusively local basis and how that helps the growth of Catholicism, the inverse. So I'll have a substantive about the importance of regionalism in the growth of Catholicism, but first, some rebuttal, okay? I want to mainly tackle their one mechanism about growth of religion, and that's basically that people in developing countries feel disenfranchised because most official saints are white and Western, right? Three responses, I guess. First, there's a tension in their case at the point where they say a vast majority of Catholics live in the developing world, Latin America, Africa, etc., etc., and this is where the highest growth rate of Catholics is because of population growth and conversion. Two, folk saints are already popular in these regions and respected locally. They fail to principally justify why we need to officially recognize these individuals as saints, because this means to universalize. We don't see an increase in the level of respect from the local people, and they didn't analyze the level of respect from global people. My partner explained why you actually get unique harms if you try to globally legitimize it. It comes across as tone deaf, like as if the culture of Brazil can be applied to the culture of Italy and DRC. These are very discrete countries. They're inherently local and contextual individuals. B, you begin to see schisms in the church at the point where you universalize, because discord will emerge between the different regions in the world where non-concordant folk saints are legitimized. So this looks like, at worst, a break-off in the church. It can potentially look like a backlash among the clergy and an incredibly conservative pope getting elected. But in a more moderate world, this looks like falling donations and declining membership and a general delegitimization of the word of the pope. Third response is that they didn't provide a mechanism as to why this will make any new people who have already got to the point where they've left the Catholic Church care, or any new people to begin with. At best, let's assume that this is something that these people care about, something that is seen as more important than the significance of the folkloric stature they hold, that this is something which is not seen as tone deaf and something which doesn't alienate other global Catholics. At best, you see a slight decline of the death of the Catholic Church because their initial analysis that as people become more wealthy and educated and knowledgeable about science, they leave anyway. I'm unclear how recognizing folk saints officially will make the church any more scientific. All right, let's deal with the claim about ideological purity, their claim that all people are sinners. I think this is a really undeveloped assertion. I would never hold in any moral system ever. We think just because people are all born with original sin, that doesn't mean that I can break all 10 commandments and be morally equal to someone who's broken 0. Likewise, if I break 10 laws, I'm not morally equal to someone who breaks 0. OG said nothing to the benefit, by the way, of the actual marginalized groups that the motion specifies. For example, criminals in need of in finance, right? But we'll take them at their best and assume they did analyze these groups. We'd say that even in this quite extreme example, we'd still not support recognize them officially because A, as my partner says, folk saints are incredibly local and contextual. What this means is B, the type of folk saint to represent a petty criminal is likely to exist in a culture where there are reasons for crime to exist, which is also very local and contextual. So the empathy is contextual. And C, universalization at this point removes this empathy and cause further schisms in the Catholic Church at the point where folk in wealthy countries begin to think, why am I being associated with crime? Why is the Catholic Church associating me with crime? This is not official Catholicism, and all of the impacts that my partner said become even stronger, right? I'll take a POI from closing.
Does your assertion not completely ignore the fact that all saints start out as folk saints and only become canonized when there's a significant degree of local and then national and international recognition?
I don't think this is true, because I think specific folk saints, for example, representing petty crime, as the motion actually talks about, is or has unique harms, which I demonstrated, right? If there is a folk saint which has something to do with, like, you know, a universal truth which represents Catholicism, like, legitimately, then fine, sure. I think that's just entirely how the status quo is currently functioning, right? Anyway, substantive. What's the importance in regionalism in the growth of Catholicism? We think we heard this from DPM, this false dichotomy that it's the Catholic Church or it's not the Catholic Church. We don't think this is true, and we don't think the idea that local saints do not exist. We just entirely reject this. So 2 premises. First, we agree that with OG that it's in the interest of the Catholic Church to grow. And 2, in its history, the Catholic Church has seen its most exponential growth when it's been able to integrate its teachings with the local communities, especially in Africa and Latin America. We'd point to Catholicism's integration with Irish paganism and its adoption of Halloween and All Saints' Day. We'd point to Mexico's Day of the Dead, which has Aztec roots. We'd point to the Catholic integration of animism in Africa and voodoo in Haiti. We think that this is how it's historically expanded. And there's two reasons why we think this is preferable to the sort of purist form of expansion that Gov prefer. We think, A, if you truly care about these globally marginalized groups, we think we would be able to represent and respect their individual cultures while also allowing them to be like loyal and pious Catholics. We think it's honestly quite colonialist if you try to make everything like entirely like exactly what the Catholic Church is about, because there's like there's a very specific regionalism that's important to these people that we don't want to erase, because while these people might be very loving and pious Catholics, they're also very happy about their Aztec or voodoo or animist roots, right? We think also this is just a very efficient way to grow. We think that you don't get the most efficient form of growth when you tell everyone it's a binary decision whether to be a Catholic or not. We think you get significantly more expansion efficiently when you tell people, okay, yeah, you can have this, you can have your folk saint can have animist roots, but this isn't exactly what the Catholic Church is all about. The Catholic Church is about this, that, and the other. And because of this, you're able to expand the Catholic Church. It doesn't die, it continues living and thriving. And because we see this amount of growth in the Catholic Church, and because we see this amount of growth in the Catholic Church, because of the mechanisms my partner and I propose, we beg you to vote opening up.
Dear panel, let me begin by outlining again what is the interest of Catholic Church and thus how you should fundamentally weigh this debate. So firstly, I think this is threefold. It's talking about how the Church overall publicity, the number of its believers, and its long-term survival are the key in this debate. And our extension is going to be about how this motion makes sense and is beneficial both theologically, practically, and for publicity. The first, and we will mechanize how the number of Catholics on our side increases and how this is fundamentally our interest. But before I move on, let's highlight what is the actual stakeholder of this debate. So there's been lots of talk about atheists, Protestants, but we think this is not fundamental. They are not the main stakeholders of this debate, because atheists won't suddenly become religious if we integrate certain saints, nor will Protestants suddenly become Catholics. And what is most important in this debate, however, is those Catholics, of which there are many and an increasing number, who are born into a Catholic culture but are losing their Catholicism because of the cultural divide between their multiple identities, be that gay, be that anything else, many different identities, and the way they can't really be reconciled in today's world. I think they are the most important, because these young Catholics who are growing in number are the ones the Church must retain in order to remain strong. Now, quick point of rebuttal. So they talked a lot about dividing Catholics. We think this is fundamentally not going to be relevant because of many reasons I'll outline later. But most importantly, Catholic fundamentalists, I don't think the other side really understands how religion works. If someone is crazy for their religion, as those people will be who will be condemning all sorts of things, they won't leave their religion just because other people are, in their perspective, sinning. Because for them, salvation is the most important. So they will stick with the Holy Catholic Church, because it's only through the Holy Catholic Church that one can go through salvation. And that is the ultimate cause of why people stick to the religion. And you can't really weigh these two together, because if you look at salvation versus, okay, having some gay people, whoever in the church, most Catholic fundamentalists will stick with actual salvation. That means sticking to the church. So we think that argument is not so relevant. So the second point of rebuttal about division is that morality constantly changes, and whatever Catholic Church says today is very different to what it usually it says in the future. So imagine this, for example, just a few years ago, decades ago, being a single parent and raising a single child was deadly condemnable by the Catholic Church. Yet today, not much less people go on about bastards and that kind of terrible things that used to be very common in the Catholic Church. That's because the Catholic Church changes as well. So whatever they say is the fundamental dogma of the Catholic Church is just a specific product of this current time. And we think the Catholic Church also changes. And yes, the Catholic Church has changed many times before and has rarely lost large amounts of followers, and definitely not for this reason. The Reformation took place for very different things rather than changes in the actual progressiveness of the Church. Now, the last point of rebuttal is about their idea that saints must be local. Now, there are many points where this is not really a false characterization of the situation. So the church fundamentally, since its existence, the Catholic Church acknowledges that you don't have to celebrate every saint. So as I've said before, there are saints for miners, there are saints for agricultural workers, there are saints for local things, there's saints for pretty much everything there exists, and that is deeply tied together with the formation of the Catholic Church. And also the second point to what they've said is that we're not even talking about just local stuff, even if you read the motion. So being a sex worker has nothing to do with locality, nor is LGBT, nor is all the other stuff. So I think by sticking to this argumentation, they're cutting out at least 50% of this motion, which we think is fundamentally unfair. But also lastly, local saints don't exist in the Catholic dogma in the sense that they are describing it, in that the Catholic Church it has a weird dichotomy in the sense that it's dogmatically unified, so all the acknowledged saints are universal, but in practice it's different, and never in the history of the Church has a single saint been celebrated by everyone. So the Catholic tradition for centuries and millennia has acknowledged this duality of not having to celebrate every single saint, but at the same time acknowledging all of them. So the main point I want you to take away from this is possibility. So our side wants the possibilities to celebrate certain saints for the reason I'll go further and explain. But one last point on this, over the long term, local saints, which first started as local, become mainstream. So for example, the Roman gods became integrated into the mainstream saints and thus become the most popular saints in Catholic dogma for the last 100 years and many years, sorry, thousands of years, because what they have taken to be local became mainstream. So we also don't think that their imagination that everything will stagnate is fundamentally true. Now I'm going to move on to why it's theologically good for the Church and completely normal for them to integrate this into their dogma. So this idea of integrating local saints is not, as folk saints, is not at all a rogue idea. It has many successful precedents within the Church. For one, take Mother Teresa, who was also a folk saint. She was very popular locally and in many different areas, but also controversial. But the saint integrated her within to the dogma as a saint, and thus the Church actually gained several followers rather than lost. Same is true for the Russian Orthodox Church. They have a lot of folk saints integrated, and none of them have caused the kind of schism which the opposition is threatening that will happen. But before I move on, is there any point of information? Okay, I have to move on now. So second point is about how this benefits the Church practically. So we support by this group identity creation, and that happens on 3 points. Firstly, by identity reconciliation. Secondly, strengthening local identity. And thirdly, retaining those believers who are a threat of being lost. So firstly, identity reconciliation. So many Catholics around the world have multiple identities, may that be local, native, tribal, LGBT, sex worker, many other identities which form integral parts of each individual are condemned by the Church and not officially endorsed, yet those people are still Catholic. And this is a fundamental schism within each individual, which often leads to the individual actually being lost from the Church because of these multiple identities being in conflict. Now that the Church endorses or allows these people to integrate these through a common saint, let's say LGBT or that kind of stuff, that would mean that these individuals could actually reconcile their multiple identities, meaning that they're less likely to turn away from the Church because of feeling conflicted and condemned as a heretic. Secondly, they will strengthen local identity. So there will be more of a debate in local areas as to what is the saint who is most important for the area, what should be valued. It will make news headlines. It will unite people in trying to figure out what is their folkloric culture, what should be integrated within the Church. This makes them much easier integrated many different cultures within the saint because they feel like they don't need to separate identities. Secondly, it raises cultural debates of what is important for them, and also preserves the traditional stories and myths like the Roman gods were preserved into the mainstream saints for the future generation. And thirdly, this is related to South America, who has a huge growth potential as the biggest Catholic and fastest growing area of Catholicism. So we think this is practically important. Thank you.
the next 7 minutes, I hope to introduce to you a new worldview, and that is the worldview of the Catholic fundamentalist, which the closing government talked about in their last speech. That is the absolutist view of religious adherence. I'm going to, in doing so, discuss the nature of purity within religious ideology, and if I am able to prove to you that from the perspective of the Catholic Church, that is the institution over which the Pope presides, if to them purity is of central importance, that is the actor of today's round, then I believe that the closing opposition ought to win today's debate. Ultimately, I think that the discussion of the number of people that they are able to cram into a church thus far is flawed, and that in general, the perspective of the religious fundamentalist is such that purity will be of central value. First, I'm going to justify why we believe that this perspective is the most appropriate for adjudicating the debate through the actor analysis. Then I'm going to talk about why I believe it is appropriate that we consider the dominant perspective from the established Catholic Church to be that of absolute adherence, bringing down everything we get out of opening government regarding forgiveness and the ability for religions to evolve. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what the pragmatic decision becomes so far as deciding between increased recruitment and the loss of ideological purity, and why the Church will always make the decision to continue to promote ideological purity over recruitment. Okay, so beginning, why ought we adjudicate this debate from the papal perspective? Specifically, we believe that the Catholic Church is the actor of this round. And I think the failure of the other teams in this round to understand what that means has been quite harmful. That is, the Catholic Church has been incredibly firm on what it holds to be its values. It has condemned homosexuality as a mortal sin. It has condemned things like even birth control in Argentina. It is incredibly clear on its conservative fundamentalist perspective. And ultimately, when we were looking, therefore, to the actor and trying to analyze what that actor, as in the Catholic Church, desires, we ought to look to the Archdiocese, we ought to look to the Pope, and all of their recent announcements have been in favor of this conservative perspective. That is, that the Catholic Church values primarily the conservative perspective wherever possible. Okay, now, why does the conservative perspective demand an absolute interpretation of Christianity? Fundamentally, we believe that the modern interpretation of the Bible is quite clear. That is, that when the Bible says narrow is the path to heaven, it is not saying that you generally get to be forgiveness, you generally get the benefit of forgiveness. Generally, it is saying that in all cases whereupon people stray, even a little bit far from the path to heaven, they are going to hell. Fundamentally, when we engage with ideas such as homosexuality, which is considered to be a mortal sin, allowing the dominant, the largest Catholic institution in the world to endorse this is a way through which people will be, as the conservative would believe, leading people astray and doing so both for people within the church and without it. And ultimately, I'm going to impact this a lot later. Fundamentally, though, people believe that in order to save that person's eternal soul, it is absolutely necessary for that person to live in the Spirit of God. And this is where we begin to get to the discussion surrounding forgiveness coming out of the opening government. I believe that the opening government is fundamentally misguided because what they are discussing is not a betrayal of Christianity's values in act, but a betrayal of those values in conviction. That is saying that they are willing to fundamentally abandon their core values in favor of new ones. And that is a change of the heart of the people within the Catholic Church. And that is not something which is considered to be easily forgiven. People can err from that path, but when they abandon the path altogether, that is when the Bible, and that is when the conservatives will tell you that you are going to be forsaken by God. And ultimately, moreover, they would tell you that like God is able to see into people's hearts and not merely through their acts. That is to say, if people say that they repent in church at the end of the day and by an indulgence, eventually, if while they are talking to the priest about their sin, if they still intend after their confession to commit that sin again, the fundamental Christian will tell you that their sin was never absolved because they never repented. All of this goes to show that generally the perspective of the fundamentalists is that there is little area through which people can stray off of the path to salvation, and so too there is very little room for forgiveness if you're willing to portray the desires of God in faith. At that point, it is reasonable to believe that the Catholic Church, once again, the institution we are talking about, is likely to believe on a true fundamental worldview level that people who celebrate these saints, view them as part of the religion, and in doing so betray the Spirit of God, will be going to hell. I'm going to impact that in my final point, telling you why the church ought never prefer recruitment over loss of ideological purity, but before that, your POI.
Look, these people already believe in the folk saints, and you don't prove how you're going to stop them from believing in the saints or changing the behavior in any way. Given that, doesn't the Catholic Church just prioritize the number, whether they stay in the church or not?
Absolutely, two responses. The first one being that the church ought to maintain its goal of trying to move these people to the fundamentalist perspective. That is the only way the church will believe that they will be truly saving those people's souls. What we are saying, in effect, is that right now they're able to sell them on Christianity light plus the regional perspectives. Ultimately, the end goal, though, is to move people away from those saints and into those officially recognized by the Catholic Church. That is why some are officially recognized and others aren't. Moreover, it is also important to realize that the act of recognizing those saints is implicit agreement with their values from the main Catholic Church, meaning that even people who don't already believe in those saints will start to be led astray by the perception that the church is endorsing things like homosexuality. Once again, a big problem for that fundamentalist perspective. Okay, so now moving on to the end harms profile. If you begin to engage in this worldview, you have to realize the magnitude of the harms associated with someone losing their eternal soul and not going to hell. Think of ideas like Pascal's wager, right? There is literally no amount of earthly value which will compensate for your eternal suffering in hell. Eternal is a really big amount of time, and so you shouldn't neglect that offhandedly. At that point, the fundamentalists would believe that they are betraying the word of God, an ontological failure. They are leading their own parishioners astray, a utilitarian failure, and then finally, they are doing nothing for those false converts, which they think that they are still failing, a pragmatic failure. At the end of the day, no constituency is served by an abandonment of ideological consistency. Thank you.
Only on our side of the house do we have a debate which is actually prioritizing the interest of the actor in this debate, the Catholic Church. Under our side of the house, this motion will not only be best for the church and for its people, but also be extremely beneficial for the precedent of the history of the church and for the church in general. So what I'm going to do in this speech is first summarize my partner's case, looking at the theological, public and practical aspect of it and why this is so important to implement this motion, and why under our side of the house it is not only the most sensible in terms of Catholic theology, but also in terms of how the Catholic Church is perceived in the world. I'm then going to wash out the opening half of the debate, which has added almost nothing, and then I'm going to rebut this extremely theologically confused speech we've just been offered by the opposition. So first of all, let's look at my partner's case and why this is the strongest case in the argument. We offer the 3 points that we need the most. First of all, theologically, there is huge theological precedent for the introduction of folk saints as real saints. First of all, because all official saints start out as folk saints. That's how saints are made. They don't just get made saints as soon as they've committed a miracle or venerated by a local population. They have to be venerated and treated as folk saints for a really long period of time before this beatification actually happens. It happens over a series of steps over time, and this all happens because folk saints exist. Folk saints exist as a way for official saints to be made. So they're not just some sort of ridiculous local ideology as the opening opposition seems to have presented to us. They are in fact a really important part of Catholic practice, an important part of how official saints are later on made. We have a really important historic precedent for folk saints being made as well, including in this century. Mother Teresa was a folk saint for many years prior to becoming an official saint, and she's one of the most popular saints the Catholic Church has ever had. Her introduction as an official saint has been one of the most popular moves Pope Francis has made. Mother Teresa is venerated around the world, even though she's considered a saint who, under opening opposition's argument, who would be very localized and very unhelpful to Catholics around the world who haven't been directly impacted by her. This is just proof of the theological precedent of implementing this motion and why folk saints and recognizing folk saints is such an important part of it. So we think it's theologically sensible. We've also seen in the most theologically similar church, the Orthodox Church, that the importance of folk saints, where they're treated more officially than we feel the Catholic Church should follow on from this continued thing of recognizing folk saints in a more official manner than than the current manner of folk saints slowly becoming official saints. So what we're saying essentially is that folk saints do often become official saints, but we'd like an increased recognition of folk saints and an increased recognition of folk saints as official saints. We're now going to talk about the practical importance of this. Practically, this is very important to people who live under multiple identities, and for whom these identities sometimes they feel preclude them from being a proper Catholic. If these identities are recognised properly, for example, LGBT identities, but also national identities are recognised by the Church by the implementation of a folk saints policy, this would be a really effective way to retain and also celebrate Catholics around the world. A particularly important example of this is Latin America, which we've already discussed. Latin American Catholics are the bulk of current devout Catholics around the world. Pope is Latin American. We have loads of examples of why the Latin American Catholicism is so important. Recognizing the large proportion of predominantly Latin American folks is a really important way for the Church to remain engaged with its people, engaged with those who are pious. And on a practical level, this is a really good way to keep people engaged with the Church, as my partner already identified, people who this motion is most impacting in terms of the Church as actor and who they feel that they're most likely to impact. It is young Catholics, particularly in countries like in parts of Latin America, who are at risk of losing their faith. We're not worried about people who aren't Catholic already. This motion is largely talking about who is already Catholic. However, there is also an element of publicity which is important for people who aren't Catholic. It's important for the perception of the Catholic Church in the wider world, as well as by those who are already its members. And practically, the recognition of folk saints has been a really important and really valuable way for the Church to gain good publicity. Also, for a lot of cases with the Catholic Church's discussions of sainthood and so on, all publicity is important. All publicity is good publicity. And again, the colonisation of countries are a big example of this. A really popular folk becoming an official saint, and even though this wasn't universally lauded by people who aren't Catholic, it generated weeks and weeks of discussion about the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church wants to remain relevant, it wants to remain discussed, and by canonising folk saints, it's a surefire way for the Church to continue remaining relevant, remaining important, not only in the minds of Catholics, in the minds of non-Catholics as well. So although we identify here the most important stakeholders in this motion of the Catholic Church and its people, those outside of it are important as well. And this is something that we feel is in the interest of the Catholic Church and how it's being perceived. I'll take the POI from OO before I move on.
Yes, thank you very much. Don't you risk running into theological schizophrenia if you start recognizing folk saints such as the Virgen de Guadalupe, a black version of the Virgin Mary made to proselytize the cult of the earth goddess Pachamama in the ends?
No, we don't feel that, because as we've already identified, the Catholic Church has incorporated centuries of tradition from other religions and other countries into its theology, also my video, but also in terms of how important the Catholic Church has been for generating more saints. And as my partner identified quite correctly, not all saints are going to be celebrated by everyone. The whole point of the Catholic Church's saints is that there are a huge amount of them, and that they can be venerated by as many people as feel that they're relevant. Those people feel folk saints are relevant, and just because they're not going to be universally relevant, they should be canonized. So we've identified the three major arguments which show why closing government have won the debate. We've brought you theology, publicity, and practicality, none of which the other teams have offered. I'll just quickly have a look at how the opening half of this debate is a wash. Opening government just talk about sort of the comparative of developing world, which we don't feel is clear or a valuable contribution, because we have given you the facts and the clear cases as to why this is so important. And they've also talked about sort of the colonialist issue and the theological issue of many saints as sinners, which we really feel was clearly explained, although we do go on to identify it much more clearly in our cases. Open opposition have just given a really unhelpful comparative about international local saints, which shows the gross misunderstanding of the Catholic Church. And now finally we're going to quickly look at the closing opposition speech, which is very theologically confusing, talking about the issue of pragmatism and theological purity. My partner's already identified that the issue of theological purity is not identified here, but it is in fact one which is adapting, altering, and responding to the world around it. I feel that canonizing folk saints is a fantastic way to do that. The idea of theological purity at the expense of members and retaining members as a priority of the Catholic Church is simply not. We don't feel that closing opposition have added anything at all to this debate. We feel that this issue of forgiveness, misguidance is really unhelpful. So for these reasons, for the theologically confusing opposition we've been offered, which actually adds very little to the debate, for the unhelpful discussion of local saints, and for opening government's failure to go far enough, we beg you to vote with closing government, who have provided all the cases needed to win this debate. Thank you.
I think that speaker and call on the op whip here.
this debate is recognize that we have to look through the view of the interests of the Catholic Church. And truly, the best interest of the Catholic Church is to maintain the purity of its members. The Catholic Church is a bastion for allowing people to access heaven for all of eternity. They do not want to lead people astray. They do not want to allow their parishioners or anyone to go to hell. If we start to change the morals of the Catholic Church falsely, then the parishioners, the people who join the church, all of it is for naught, because the religious principles are not being followed, and thus people will not have access to the beneficial afterlife. It's my little bit of framework here, but how we should be viewing the round as brought to you by my partner, because Catholic fundamentalism is a conservative view in which they have to make sure that people are going into heaven, and the Catholic Church is the key. Okay, I have two questions that I'm going to talk about here. First is in the process of becoming saints, and second is on the moral versus practical dichotomy that we have found ourselves here. First, the process of becoming state. CG really tries to mess with the debate when they say all saints were once folk saints. The difference specifically in the examples that were given in the info slide and what this debate is really about is those who were denied sainthood by the Catholic Church because they were seen to be living as sinners and as such not holding up to the vision of the Catholic Church. This is why these people are not saints. They are not seen as, performing the miracles. They are not seen as correctly obtaining sainthood. This is why there's a difference. Growing up in a town in which we got the recognition of a local saint, they were able to meet the qualifications of having lived the proper life and performing miracles both in their life and after their death. With the example of curing someone of terminal illness, these saints are found to not do that, to suddenly change and to accept the sinning principles in which they espouse during their lives, is to fundamentally change the way in which the Catholic Church interprets its doctrine, and this is harmful. This brings me to the moral versus practical. Both people had cameras on. Whoever speaks first, take the POI.
Yeah, thank you. So your discussion of folk saints completely ignores the fact that not all folk saints are folk saints just because they disagree with the Catholic Church. Some of them are also a case of time. How do you respond to that?
Where in this debate, the examples given to us were people who were paid for crime and for things like prostitution and gay rights, which the Catholic Church adamantly stands against. These are not all folk saints. We are obviously talking about the folk saints who are celebrated as having gone against Catholic tradition and Catholic morals. This is where the engagement in the debate is. To define it otherwise is to define government a win, saying, yes, all saints were folk saints. That's the natural process of it. Okay, on to the moral versus the practical, and why we cannot care about the practical. When my partner brings up Pascal's wager, the idea is that the eternal is forever. If we are to make a change, and it is to damn us to hell forever, we must be sure of that change. And it is not risk making substantial changes that will affect our ability to move into heaven. This is where the practical concerns fall. Because when we start to celebrate saints who directly conflict with religious doctrine, the church then needs to change its doctrine. We already see the church not doing this in many precedents. My partner mentioned birth control in Argentina, and this is specifically important because people's lives would be much better if the Catholic Church allowed for birth control. Statistics showing better growth, income of countries, but it is against the moral principles. To use birth control to prevent conception is a sin and will keep people from obtaining the ability to go to heaven. As such, the Catholic Church cannot and has shown that it will not negate or go back on these principles, because it has the utmost of importance of allowing humans to obtain absolution for their sins, and it must allow and describe how to live the better life. OG has been wanting a POI, take it.
Yep. Look, read the motion. These folk saints weren't gay or prostitutes. They weren't being made saints because they're conflicting with the Catholic Church. They're just listening to the prayers of sinners, which is entirely compatible with the doctrine of salvation as being accessible to all.
Except the problem is the story of these saints, why they are who are prayed to by these individuals, is because of their effects. The example that opening talked about was someone who stole things during a war and is now prayed to by those who are stealing things to survive, right? It is their actions that led to them to being recognized as saints for those actions, and why the Catholic Church denied them the canonization of being saints, and why they are not considered, and why we are having this debate. And is because that the Catholic Church cannot go against its morals, because within their hands is the eternal salvation of their members and of future members. Let's say that you really think that the practical part of this debate still has a place, that the importance of the Catholic Church is to increase their members. Here is why that does not work. If you are increasing your membership and the members participate in these immoral actions, they will not achieve salvation. At that point, the Catholic Church has failed its duty. And this failure is the reason why the Catholic Church cannot recognize these folk saints. It is why the Catholic Church must maintain religious and moral purity, and why recognizing these saints leads people astray. What have I brought you in this debate? I have explained how the framework must be through the Catholic Church, and how the impetus of the Catholic Church is to assure that its members are able to achieve salvation. I've described how the process of becoming saints is different from what we are directly talking about, and how we are talking about people who the Catholic state has denied canonization. And then I've told you why the moral principles of the Catholic Church are the most important parts of this debate, and why morally they cannot risk the allowing of these actions and the allowing of these saints. Thank you.